On a jagged November night in 1913, the Great Lakes of America became a graveyard. A storm, later called the White Hurricane, descended with the fury of 1,000 hammers. Winds screamed at 90 miles per hour, and waves the size of cathedrals swallowed gargantuan steel freighters whole. Within 5 hours, 12 ships vanished. Hundreds of sailors were entombed in the icy deep. But one man did not sink. He didn't have a lifeboat. He didn't have a life jacket. For 36 hours, he clung to a floating hatch cover in water that should have frozen his blood in minutes. This is not just a story of survival. It is the true account of how one man's refusal to die uncovered a corporate conspiracy that changed American maritime law forever. The Golden Door and the Iron Deck. The year was 1910. Stanislaus stepped off the boat at Ellis Island, the salt of the Atlantic still crusting his wool coat. Like millions of others, he looked at the Statue of Liberty not as a monument, but as a promise. He changed his name to Stanley. He wanted a name that sounded like iron, strong, American, and unyielding. By 1913, Stanley found himself in the booming heart of the Midwest, the Great Lakes. To the world, the inland seas were the engines of American industry. Steel for the skyscrapers of Chicago and coal for the furnaces of Detroit moved across these waters. Stanley signed on as a wheelsman for the SS Regina, a 250-foot package freighter. The pay was good, but the air felt heavy. The captains were being pushed by the steel trusts to make one last run before the winter freeze. "Time is money," the corporate offices in Cleveland messaged. "The ice doesn't care about your wallet," the old sailors whispered. Stanley, young and hungry for the American dream, ignored the whispers. The White Hurricane. On November 7, 1913, the barometer dropped so fast the needles on the ship's gauges seemed to spin. The SS Regina was steaming north through Lake Huron, loaded with iron pipe and canned goods. By noon, the sky turned a bruised purple. Then came the snow. It wasn't the soft, drifting snow of a Christmas card. It was horizontal ice, sharp as glass, blinding the lookouts. The White Hurricane had arrived. This was a seiche, a rare weather phenomenon, where the wind pushes the water to one side of the lake, creating massive, unpredictable surges. Stanley stood at the wheel, his knuckles white. The captain, James McConnell, screamed orders over the roar of the gale. The waves were now 40 feet high. They hit the Regina like a battering ram. The steel hull groaned, a sound like a dying animal. "She's taking on water!" the first mate yelled. The pumps were failing. The coal was wet. The fires in the engine room were sputtering. In the darkness of the storm, they heard a terrifying sound, a whistle. Another ship was nearby, lost in the whiteout. It was the SS Isaac M. Scott. The collision was inevitable. The abyss. When the ships collided, it wasn't a crash, it was a grinding of tectonic plates. The Regina began to list heavily to the port side. Stanley was thrown across the bridge. He scrambled up, his lungs burning with the freezing air. "Abandon ship!" But there was no time. The Regina capsized in less than 10 minutes. As the ship turned over, Stanley was sucked into the vortex. The water was 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius. At this temperature, the human body usually shuts down in under 15 minutes. Muscles cramp, the heart slows, and the mind slips into a merciful sleep before the lungs fill with water. Stanley broke the surface, gasping. He was alone in a chaotic world of black water and white foam. He saw a piece of debris, a wooden hatch cover from the cargo hold. He lunged for it. 36 hours of ghosthood. For the next day and a half, Stanley Mazur ceased to be a man and became a part of the lake. To stay awake, he recited the names of his family in Poland. To stay warm, he sang American folk songs he had heard in the taverns of Buffalo. He watched the sun rise and set over a horizon of ice. He saw other bodies floating by, frozen solid in their life jackets, men who had followed the rules but died anyway. He realized a grim truth. The life jackets provided by the company were filled with cheap cork that absorbed water, pulling the men down instead of lifting them up. His hands became raw, the skin peeling away from the friction of the wood. His legs were numb. He began to hallucinate. He saw his mother standing on the water, pointing toward the shore. He saw the Regina rising from the depths like a ghost ship. On the morning of the second day, the wind died down. The lake, exhausted by its own fury, became a sheet of glass. A Canadian tugboat searching for wreckage spotted a dark shape on a piece of wood. When the sailors pulled Stanley onto the deck, they thought he was a corpse. His clothes were frozen to the wood. They had to use warm water to melt him off the hatch cover. Then the corpse opened its eyes and asked for a cigarette. The survivor's burden. The Great Lakes storm of 1913 killed 250 people. Stanley was one of the few survivors of the major wrecks, but his battle was just beginning. The shipping companies wanted the tragedy buried. They blamed act of God clauses to avoid paying insurance to the families of the drowned. They claimed the ships were seaworthy. Stanley, still recovering from frostbite that nearly cost him his feet, was called to testify. He was offered hush money by men in silk suits. They told him he could have a farm in Ohio, a quiet life, if he just said the storm was too big for any ship to survive. Stanley looked at the widows in the courtroom. He remembered the frozen faces of his crewmates in the water. He stood up in the federal inquiry and pulled out a piece of the cork from a recovered life jacket. He squeezed it, and black, oily water dripped onto the floor. The storm was an act of God, Stanley thundered in his thick accent, but these life jackets were an act of greed. Stanley's testimony sparked a national scandal. The La Follette Seamen's Act of 1915 was fast-tracked through the U.S. Congress. It mandated better living conditions for sailors, required lifeboats that actually worked, and ended the corporate immunity that had allowed the steel trusts to gamble with human lives. Stanley Mazur never went back to the lakes. He moved to the American West, where the ground didn't move and the water stayed in the wells. He lived to be 80 years old. Every year, on the anniversary of the storm, he would sit on his porch with a glass of whiskey and a bowl of ice. He would watch the ice melt, a silent tribute to the men who stayed in the deep and the ghost who came back to tell their story.